In the brutal winter of 1887, when every other widow in the territory was burying her dead and abandoning her claim, Carol Hart was doing something that looked like madness. She was charging 12 families 2 pennies apiece to bake their bread in her only possession, a communal stone oven, and letting them sleep on its cooling stones. She had no husband, no wood, and no other heat. But what began as a desperate business with no future would become the one thing that kept an entire village alive, and the twist that followed would change all of their lives forever. Her name was Carol Hart. She was 29 years old, a widow with no savings, no family farm, and no hope of remarrying through the frozen months ahead. Her husband had died of pneumonia 6 weeks before the first hard frost, leaving her with a half-built cabin, an empty larder, and a single inheritance that felt more like a curse. A massive stone bread oven, the only thing of value on her claim. In a land where survival belonged to men with strong backs and stocked woodpiles, Carol possessed neither. She had only that oven, and a reckless idea that would force every neighbor who ever pitied her to declare her dangerously, stubbornly insane. The question that winter wasn't whether she would survive. It was whether her oven would become the heart of a community, or the furnace that consumed them all. The first hard frost came to Miller's Fork a week before All Saints' Day, splitting the mud roads into frozen plates and killing the last of the garden behind the Hart cabin. Carol stood near the stone oven's mouth, watching the fire catch. The oven was a monster of fieldstone and clay, 8 feet long, 6 feet high, with a baking chamber deep enough to hold 20 loaves and a brick bench along its back wall that held heat better than any iron stove. Her husband's father, a stonemason from Wales, had built it 40 years earlier for a family that never arrived. Now it sat behind a half-built cabin with no wood pile, no pantry, and a roof that still leaked when the wind blew certain ways. But that morning, as smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray line, the heat inside the stone was not only for her. A woman named Ida Harper had arrived before dawn carrying a bowl of proof dough wrapped in old flour sacks. She had 2 children shivering behind her, their shoes stuffed with grass. She placed 3 pennies in Carol's palm, the first money Carol had seen since her husband's funeral. By noon, the bread was baked, and the Harper family was seated on the brick bench inside the oven house, pressing their bodies against the warm stones while the wind clawed at the wooden walls outside. That was the exact moment Carol's business was born. Over the next week, word spread that the widow Hart was selling heat. Not firewood, not food, just the lingering warmth of her oven stones for pennies a night. It was an arrangement no one in the territory had ever heard of. The oven's design made it possible. Unlike a normal bake oven that cooled quickly, this one, built with a double fire channel and a thick cob blanket, stayed warm for nearly 15 hours after the flames died. By evening, after the bread was done and the coals raked aside, the flat stone slab where the fire had sat radiated a gentle, even heat that could keep a body alive through the night. Carol's system was careful. She assigned each family a baking time in the morning, staggered so the fire never completely died. At dusk, when the outdoor air dropped to killing cold, the families who could pay 2 pennies were allowed to sleep along the oven's warming bench, their bodies packed together beneath wool blankets and old quilts. The rich ones, if you could call them that, paid an extra cent for a spot closest to the fire door. Within 10 days, 12 families had paid to use the oven, not out of charity, not out of fondness, but because they had no other choice. Their own cabins were drafty boxes with thin wood stoves that ate firewood faster than any man could split. The forest near Miller's Fork had been cleared for homesteading, leaving precious little timber for fuel. A winter without adequate heat meant frozen toes, dead livestock, and sometimes dead children. Carol's oven, for all its strangeness, was the only reliable heat in the valley that didn't require a small fortune in cordwood. But not everyone saw it that way. Jacob Creed, who owned the only working sawmill within 40 miles, had built his fortune on selling lumber and split firewood at extortionate prices. To him, Carol's oven was an attack on his survival. One afternoon, while Carol was resetting the firebox stones that had shifted from the constant heating, Creed rode up with his foreman. He dismounted without permission and walked around the oven house, his face unreadable. "You're charging families to sleep in a kitchen like animals," he finally said. "This place will burn down before Christmas, and I'll be the one burying the ashes." Carol didn't answer. She kept her hands in the clay mortar, sealing the gap. But the veiled threat was clear. If the oven failed, Creed would be the first to declare her liable for any deaths, and the oven was already showing signs of weakness. The constant heating and cooling had begun to crack the mortar at the firebox arch. A faint hairline fracture ran from the loading door to the chimney base, something only Carol noticed at night when the firelight caught the edge of the stone. She knew that if that crack opened, carbon monoxide could pour into the sleeping space, or worse, the entire roof might collapse into the flames. The weather did not wait for her to fix it. On the second week of December, the temperature plunged to 20 below, and a dry, powdery snow began to fall so thick it erased the horizon. By evening, 2 feet had buried the wagon roads. Families who had come for their baking slots that morning could not leave. They were trapped inside Carol's claim with no way home. That night the oven house held not just 12 sleepers but 17, 5 more than Carol had ever planned for, including an infant and a man with a cough that sounded like death rattling in his chest. The heat from the stones was not enough for all of them. Tempers frayed in the darkness. A woman named Gertie Shaw accused another of hogging the warmest spot. A child began to cry without stopping. And then, around midnight, a sound cut through the howl of the storm, a sharp, splintering crack. Carol turned toward the firebox and saw that the hairline fracture had widened. A thin jet of flame was flickering through the gap, licking the wooden support beam above it. The oven, her only asset, was about to fail. The furnace that was keeping them alive was also poised to consume them all. Carol saw the flame before anyone else did. A thin tongue of fire, blue at the base and orange at the tip, slipped through the widened crack near the firebox arch and licked at the wooden support beam above the loading door. In that frozen instant, 18 people who had been arguing and shoving and sheltering in the warmth of the oven house all fell silent. The only sound was the wind clawing at the walls and the sharp crackle of something that was never supposed to burn. She moved without thinking. She grabbed a bucket of snow from just outside the door, packed it hard against the flame with her bare hands, and screamed at Ida Harper to wet the clay barrel. The beam was already darkening, a faint curl of smoke rising from the old pine. Carol dug wet clay from the barrel with her fingers and shoved it into the crack while the fire inside the oven still roared at full heat. The heat seared her palms. The smell of burning wool rose from her sleeves, but she held the clay in place, packing it deeper until the flame choked and died, and the only thing coming through the gap was a thin hiss of escaping steam. Ida Harper wrapped a damp cloth around Carol's hands while Gertie Shaw, the woman who had accused others of hogging warmth just minutes before, silently pulled her own child close and made room. No one spoke. The storm outside was still burying the valley under fresh snow, and the fire that had nearly killed them was the only thing keeping them alive. But in the silence that followed, every person inside that oven house understood the same terrible truth. They were not just trapped by the blizzard. They were trapped inside a structure that had just proven it could fail without warning. The storm did not break that night or the next day. For 3 full days, the blizzard pinned 17 souls inside the oven house, while the firebox crack wept steam, and Carol watched the support beam like a hawk watching a wounded animal. She allowed the fire to burn only low enough to keep the stones warm, not hot enough to bake, even though it meant the bread supply would dwindle. Families took turns pressing wet clay against the crack whenever a new fissure appeared. The infant's crying softened into a thin, exhausted whimper. The man with the cough grew quieter, and that stillness frightened Carol more than the coughing had. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind finally stopped. The world outside was a vast white blank, the wagon roads gone, the other cabins buried to their chimneys. One by one, the families dug their way out through a narrow trench and began the slow trudge toward their own homesteads. Carol stood in the doorway of the oven house, her bandaged hands aching, and watched them go. She counted them as they left. 17 had entered. 17 would leave alive. But the crack in the firebox was still there, hidden beneath a patch of half-dried clay, and she knew that the next storm could finish what this one had started. Word of the crack spread faster than the snow had. Jacob Creed heard it from a homesteader who had been inside the oven house that night, and by noon he was telling anyone who would listen that the widow Hart was operating a death trap. He stood near the frozen creek where men were salvaging firewood, his voice carrying in the still air. His sawmill had never been busier. The price of split cordwood had tripled since the first frost, and he had a vested interest in making sure that no family in Miller's Fork ever again believed that a stone oven could replace a proper wood stove. "That crack ain't a flaw," he told the gathered men. "That's the whole oven breaking apart from the inside. Next time, it won't just be a scare. She'll burn a dozen people alive in their sleep." But something strange happened in the days that followed. The families who had been inside the oven house during the storm did not abandon Carol. They came back, not just for the heat but to help. Ida Harper arrived with her husband, a quiet man who had once worked as a brickmaker in Ohio. He examined the firebox arch with a leather apron wrapped around his chest and his breath clouding in the cold. He studied the crack for nearly an hour, then asked Carol a question that changed everything. "Did your husband ever mention a secondary draft?" Carol didn't understand at first, but when the man described it, a hidden channel built into the stone that could pull fresh air beneath the fire to control its intensity, she remembered something. In the last weeks of his life, her husband had spoken of his father's oven as if it held secrets no one had ever discovered. He had said that the old mason had built it not just to bake bread, but to warm an entire communal hall back in Wales. He had pointed toward a small iron ring near the chimney base, half buried in the mortar, and said, "That one changes everything if you know how to use it." It had never occurred to Carol to pull that ring. She had assumed it was a remnant of the construction, a forgotten anchor for some old crane. But now, with the brickmaker's help, she poured water around the ring to soften the frozen mortar, and together they pulled. The ring moved with a groan, and a hidden vent opened inside the oven's innermost wall, drawing air from a narrow wind channel that ran along the floor. The effect was immediate. The fire settled. The heat became steadier, less violent. And within hours, the crack in the firebox arch, no longer subjected to the wild temperature swings of an uncontrolled burn, stopped widening. Carol had not inherited a simple oven. She had inherited a carefully engineered heating system designed to keep a large room warm without consuming a forest. The secret had been buried in plain sight for 40 years, and now it was the only thing that could save them. But Jacob Creed was not finished. When he learned that Carol had somehow repaired the oven and was attracting more families than ever, he did something that shocked the entire settlement. He offered free firewood to any family who promised never to step inside Carol's claim again. It was a brute force tactic that few could afford to refuse. Within 2 days, 4 families took the deal. They left the oven stacking Creed's split pine against their own cabin walls, and Carol watched her client list shrink to a handful of the most desperate souls. The pennies stopped coming. The flour barrel ran low, and the oven, for all its hidden genius, began to cool for the first time since autumn. The turning point came from a child. Benny Shaw, Gertie's 8-year-old son, had been one of the children who slept on the warming bench. One afternoon, he appeared at the oven house door pulling a small sled loaded with firewood, not from Creed's mill, but scavenged from down branches along the creek. He asked Carol if he could trade wood for a night's warmth. He said his mother had refused Creed's deal because she didn't trust a man who made his living off other people's fear. That small, defiant gesture was the spark. By evening, 2 other families who had taken Creed's wood were back, shamefaced but alive. They had burned through the free supply in 3 days and now had nothing except frozen cabins and a growing dread of the next storm. The oven house began to fill again. But this time, something had shifted. The families were no longer just customers paying for a service. They were a community that had nearly lost its only shelter and was now fighting to protect it. Men arrived with axes and river clay. Women brought flour and salt in stories that made the long nights bearable. The oven became the heart of the valley, its glow visible from the ridge line on clear nights, a warm orange beacon in a sea of white. Inside, the crack was sealed with lime mortar and braced with an iron strap salvaged from a broken wagon. The secondary draft hummed softly in the floor, keeping the air fresh and the stones warm without burning. For the first time, Carol allowed herself to believe that the worst was over. She was wrong. In the third week of January, the sky over Miller's Fork turned the color of old lead, and the temperature dropped to 35 degrees below zero. This was not a storm. This was a frozen siege that made the December blizzard look like a spring squall. The wind did not howl, it shrieked. Snow fell so thick that a man could not see his own barn from his front door. The families who had any sense stayed inside their own cabins, burning whatever they could find. But the cabins were not built for that kind of cold. Frost crept through the log walls. Fingers turned white and numb. One by one, those families began to make the impossible choice to abandon their homes and crawl through the drifts toward the only source of reliable heat in the valley. By nightfall, Carol's oven house held 31 people. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, lying in layers on the warming bench and the floor, breathing each other's breath, their clothes steaming in the heat of the stones. The oven was burning hotter than it ever had, and Carol stood at the fire door with the iron ring pulled fully open, praying that the draft would hold. Outside, Jacob Creed's sawmill roof collapsed under the weight of snow, and his carefully hoarded lumber pile snapped apart like kindling. The same man who had tried to destroy Carol's reputation was now trapped inside his own frozen home with nothing but a broken stove and a dwindling stack of wood he could no longer afford to burn. But inside the oven house, a different kind of crisis was building. The chimney, never designed to vent smoke from such an intense burn, began to struggle. A faint haze of smoke gathered near the ceiling beams, stinging eyes and burning throats. Carol opened the small window vent near the roof peak, but the wind outside forced the smoke back down. The secondary draft, the one that had saved them, was now pulling too much cold air into the firebox, making the fire burn faster and hotter, consuming firewood at an alarming rate. The supply would not last the night, and sitting in the farthest corner, barely conscious, was a woman named Emma Thorne, 8 months pregnant and already experiencing the first sharp pains of labor. Carol stood in the center of that packed room, smoke burning her lungs, the firewood pile shrinking to a few armloads, a woman going into labor in the cold, and the man who had tried to ruin her freezing to death somewhere out in the storm. She had one choice: turn down the draft and risk the crack reopening, or keep the fire roaring and watch the last of the fuel disappear. The oven that had been their salvation was now a trap of a different kind, and the night had barely begun. Carol looked at the firewood pile, then at Emma Thorne curled against the far wall with both hands pressed into her lower back and her teeth clenched against a scream. The smoke was now a thin white veil hanging just below the ceiling beams, and every breath tasted of ash and damp wool. 31 pairs of eyes turned to her, waiting. She could feel the crack in the firebox arch, still sealed but alive beneath its clay patch, a hairline fracture that heat and cold were playing against each other like two wolves fighting over a bone. If she opened the secondary draft any wider to clear the smoke, the fire would burn even faster and consume the last of the fuel. If she closed it to slow the burn, the smoke would thicken and the oven might choke them all before morning. There was no right choice. There was only the choice that killed them slower. She pulled the iron ring partway shut. Not all the way, just enough to starve the fire of its hungriest air. The flame inside the firebox settled from a roar to a deep, steady purr, and the smoke began to thin as the oven exhaled through the chimney instead of into the room. The heat dropped slightly, but the stones held their warmth, and the crack did not move. For the moment they had borrowed a few more hours, but the firewood stack, which had been waist-high at dusk, was now barely above her knees. At the current burn rate, they would have nothing left by 3 in the morning, and the temperature outside was still falling. Gertie Shaw took Emma's hand. The woman's contractions were coming faster now, 5 minutes apart by the tin clock above the fire door. There was no midwife in the oven house that night, only a farmer's wife named Hester who had delivered 3 of her own children and remembered enough to be terrified. She asked for clean water, cloth, and a blanket to drape across the corner. There was no water that wasn't already melted snow, and the cleanest cloth was a flour sack that still smelled of wheat. The baby was coming, and nothing in the oven house was ready. Then the door rattled. At first everyone thought it was the wind, another violent gust hammering the latch, but the rattle came again, deliberate, human. A man's voice, muffled by the storm and the thick oak planks, called out a single word: "Please." Carol pulled the door open against the snow and found a boy standing in the drift, his face raw with frost, his eyelashes frozen together. He was one of Jacob Creed's mill hands, barely 17, and he was sobbing so hard his chest convulsed. He said that Creed's cabin had collapsed, that the sawmill owner was pinned beneath a fallen roof beam, and his family was trapped in the corner with no fire and no way to escape. "He'll die," the boy choked. "They'll all die unless someone helps." Silence swallowed the oven house. Every person inside remembered what Jacob Creed had done. The threats, the bribes, the free firewood that was meant to destroy Carol's only livelihood. He had tried to starve her out, and now his own fortress had crumbled. Several voices said no. A man near the fire door said that Creed would have done the same for them, nothing. Another woman muttered that God's justice was sometimes cold. But Carol was already pulling on her coat. She asked for volunteers. 4 men stood slowly, not eager but willing. Ida Harper's husband grabbed a coil of rope. The mill boy led them out into the white fury. The trek to Creed's claim was less than half a mile, but in the drifts it took nearly an hour. They followed the boy's tracks backward through the snow, the wind stripping the breath from their lungs and freezing the moisture inside their scarves. When they reached the sawmill owner's homestead, the scene was exactly what the boy had described. A massive pine support beam had split under the weight of snow and punched through the cabin roof, pinning Creed's leg beneath its weight. His wife and 2 daughters were huddled in the corner behind a broken door, their faces blue, their fire nothing but cold ash. Creed was conscious, his eyes wild with pain and a terror he had never allowed himself to feel before. When he saw Carol standing in the shattered doorway, his face twisted through a dozen emotions before landing on one she had never seen in him: shame. The men used the rope and a broken wagon jack to lift the beam enough for Carol to drag Creed free. His leg was badly broken, the bone pressing outward against his trousers, but he was alive. His wife fell into Carol's arms and wept without words. They wrapped the family in all the blankets they had brought and began the slow return through the storm, half carrying Creed on a makeshift sled made from his own ruined door. By the time they reached the oven house, the firewood was nearly gone, and Emma Thorne's labor had progressed to the point of no return. Hester had done what she could. Emma was now on a pallet near the fire door, the warmest spot, and the first crown of the baby's head was visible. The smoke was gone. The chimney had found its draw, but the oven was now running on the very last armful of split pine. Carol knelt beside the firebox and looked at the pile. 8 logs left. Maybe 5 if she could make each one burn longer by adjusting the draft. The clock showed 2:47 in the morning. The storm outside showed no sign of breaking. 32 people, including Jacob Creed and his injured leg and his terrified children, were depending on an oven that would be cold by sunrise if something did not change. Then she heard the sound she had been dreading since December. A sharp, brittle snap, not from the firewood but from the firebox arch. The crack had not only reopened, it had split further, a fresh line running horizontally from the first fracture, and a puff of gray smoke curled into the room. The draft adjustment had slowed the fire, but the temperature shift had stressed the stone in a new direction. The oven was breaking apart, and that was when Ida Harper's husband did something neither Carol nor anyone else expected. He walked to the far corner of the oven house where the old brickmaker's tools had been stored since autumn, and he pulled out a coil of thin iron wire, a pair of heavy tongs, and a small hand-forged clamp. He said that he had been studying the oven for weeks, that he had seen the weakness in the arch long before the storm, and that he and his wife had been preparing for this night in secret. He asked Carol to open the firebox door fully so he could reach inside the arch while the fire still burned. She stared at him. The heat was intense, enough to blister skin at arm's length. But he wrapped wet leather around his hands and forearms, knelt in front of the flames, and reached into the roaring firebox with the iron clamp. The room watched in horrified silence as he guided the clamp into the crack and tightened it with tongs, drawing the two sides of the split stone back together with nothing but a thin band of metal. It was a desperate, almost impossible repair, something no mason would ever attempt in a hot oven, but it held. The smoke stopped. The crack, for the second time, was sealed. The baby was born 10 minutes later, a small, furious girl with a full head of dark hair and a cry that cut through the storm like a knife. Hester placed her on Emma's chest, and the sound that filled the oven house was not wind or cracking stone, but raw, exhausted weeping from half a dozen mothers who had all been holding their breath. Jacob Creed, lying on a plank near the back wall with his shattered leg splinted with chair rungs, watched the scene in silence, his face unreadable. His wife had not left Carol's side since the rescue, but the firewood was now completely gone. The last log was a charred stump barely the length of a man's arm, and the oven's heat had already begun to soften. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 38 below. The cold was no longer a weather condition. It was a living predator pressing against the walls, searching for any gap in the chinking, any thin spot in the roof. If the oven went cold before dawn, the bobbies and the wounded would die first, and the rest would follow within hours. And then Gertie Shaw stood up, walked to the sled that her son had used to haul scavenged firewood, and began breaking it apart with her bare hands. The wood was dry birch, not ideal for burning but better than nothing. She fed the pieces into the firebox one by one, and the flames licked up around them with a grateful hiss. A second woman followed, dragging a broken bench that had been used for seating. A third man went outside into the storm and dug out a section of the old snow fence behind the cabin, bringing back planks coated in ice. They burned. The community was feeding the oven not with firewood but with the very pieces of their lives that could be spared. That night, 31 people survived on sled runners, bench legs, a door from a broken cupboard, and the wooden yoke from an ox harness that had not seen a live ox in years. The oven never went cold. It hummed and crackled and continued breathing warmth into the room while the wind screamed across the valley and the drifts climbed higher than the windows. Jacob Creed watched his neighbors break apart their own belongings to keep the fire alive, and for the first time since he had arrived in Miller's Fork, he said nothing about profits or prices. He simply stared at the flames and the metal clamp holding the arch together, and his eyes, which had always been hard with calculation, now looked hollowed out by something that might have been understanding. The Big Freeze, as it would later be called in the territory, lasted 11 days. Temperatures stayed below -30 the entire time, and the wind never completely stopped. The oven house became the central refuge for every family in Miller's Fork whose cabin had failed. By the end of the siege, 61 people had taken shelter at Carol's claim at various points, sleeping in shifts, sharing food, burning everything that could safely burn. The stone oven, which had begun the winter as a desperate widow's only asset, had become the sole reason an entire settlement survived the worst winter in living memory. When the first thaw came in late February, the valley looked like a battlefield. Cabins were half-collapsed under drift loads. Barns had been gutted for firewood. Livestock losses were catastrophic. But the census of the dead in Miller's Fork was shockingly small. One elderly trapper who refused to leave his claim, and a young boy who had been lost in the December blizzard and never found. Every other soul had made it to Carol's oven before the worst of the cold arrived. The stone arch, still holding together behind its iron clamp, had never failed again. But the true cost was only beginning to reveal itself as the snow melted. Carol's cabin, which she had never finished repairing after her husband's death, had suffered heavy damage from the weight of snow. The roof sagged dangerously. The back wall leaned outward. The floorboards had warped from moisture and cold. She had spent the winter saving everyone else, and now her own home was barely standing. The pennies she had earned from the oven had bought flour and salt, and a single bolt of wool cloth, not lumber, not nails, not the weeks of labor needed to rebuild a collapsing cabin. And Jacob Creed, who owed Carol his life and the lives of his entire family, saw the state of her house and said nothing. His sawmill was destroyed, his lumber scattered across 3 acres under broken snow and tangled with roofing debris. He had no wealth left to offer, no wood to sell, no leverage to wield. He was, for the first time in his adult life, a poor man among poor people. The broken leg would heal crooked, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his days, a living reminder that the man who had tried to bury Carol's oven had been dug out of his own wreckage by the woman he had condemned. As the ground softened and the first green shoots appeared along the creek, a quiet understanding began to spread through Miller's Fork. The winter had taken almost everything from everyone. But it had also proven something that no one in the valley could now deny. The communal oven was not just a heat source or a bread oven or a makeshift shelter. It was the reason they were alive. And the woman who had risked her life tending it, who had shoved clay into a burning crack with her bare hands, who had walked into a blizzard to save her enemy, that woman was now facing a season of rebuilding with nothing but a cracked oven and a collapsing house. The 12 families who had originally rented heat from Carol began to gather in the evenings around the oven house, not for warmth anymore, but for something else. They talked in low voices. They looked at the broken cabin, the sagging roof, the wall that would not survive the next heavy rain. And slowly, without fanfare or announcement, they began collecting the one thing that winter had taught them to value above all else: each other's labor. What they planned to do would become the final twist in a story that had already twisted more times than anyone could count, because Carol Hart was about to discover that the community she had saved now intended to save her right back. Carol did not know what the 12 families were planning. She spent the first days of March walking through the slush and mud of the melting valley, cataloging the damage to her cabin with a sinking heart. The back wall leaned outward at a sickening angle. The roof ridge had cracked down the middle, and daylight showed through gaps where the shingles had slid. She had spent every penny on flour and salt and a bolt of wool for bandages, and now she was facing a spring with no lumber, no nails, and no hired hands. She began dragging fallen branches from the creek, stacking them near the cabin foundation, doing the only thing she knew how to do, starting alone. Then Ida Harper appeared on the path with a hammer in one hand and a coil of salvaged nails in the other. Behind her came Gertie Shaw and her son Benny, carrying a saw between them. Then Hester, the woman who had caught Emma's baby in the firelight, leading a line of women with buckets. Then the brickmaker and his wife. Then the mill boy who had led Carol into the storm to save Jacob Creed, carrying a splitting maul over his shoulder. By mid-morning, 23 people stood in the mud outside Carol's ruined cabin, and the silence that settled over them was not one of hesitation but of purpose. Ida Harper spoke first. "You kept this fire alive with nothing but your hands. Now you'll have a house that can do the same." She did not ask permission. She picked up a pry bar and began pulling the warped boards from the leaning back wall while the others fell into position around her like a crew that had rehearsed the moment. The rebuilding began with salvaged materials from every homestead that owed Carol a life. Men brought planks pried from their own collapsed sheds. Women brought iron nails straightened from old barn beams. Children brought fistfuls of bent spikes and the rusted heads of hammers that still had one good swing left. The creek became a supply line, with teams hauling water for clay mortar while others dug a new foundation trench closer to the oven house itself. The new cabin would not sit where the old one had. It would be connected to the oven house by a covered breezeway, so that the heat from the stones would never again have to travel through a howling snowstorm to reach the people who needed it. The brickmaker took charge of the stonework. He argued that the oven's firebox arch was now stable with the iron clamp, but it needed a permanent stone buttress to prevent future cracking. He directed a crew to quarry flat rocks from the ridge, and set them against the arch in a sloping brace that looked like a piece of cathedral architecture dropped into frontier mud. The crack that had nearly killed 31 people became the strongest part of the oven, reinforced with iron and stone and the calloused hands of the people it had saved. And then Jacob Creed arrived. He came limping up the path on a crutch made from a cedar branch, his broken leg splinted with chair rungs that still bore the marks of Gertie Shaw's kitchen. He stopped at the edge of the work site and watched the hive of activity in silence. His wife stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm as though to hold him upright. For a long moment, no one acknowledged him. The sounds of sawing and hammering continued, and it would have been easy for him to turn around and disappear back to his ruined mill. Instead, he spoke. "The lumber that's scattered across my claim," he said, his voice flat and tired. "Every stick of it, bring it here, all of it." He did not ask for payment. He did not offer a trade. He just nodded once, and the mill boy who had once worked for him was the first to start toward the Creed claim with a sled. By nightfall, a small mountain of milled boards and planks had appeared beside the foundation trench, enough to frame an entire cabin and sheath it tight against any winter that would ever come. The work continued for 6 days. The new cabin rose from the mud in layers of salvaged pine and fresh clay chinking, its roofline angled to sluice snow into the drift zone Carol had learned to manage. The breezeway connected the living quarters to the oven house, so that the baking heat would flow through the shared wall like a slow breath. Families who had once argued over warm spots on a stone bench now argued over who got to shingle the south slope or who could carry the hearthstone up from the creek bed. Children ran back and forth hauling water and bent nails, their feet bare in the first warm mud of April. On the 7th morning, the final piece was set. The brickmaker had reserved one task for Carol alone, placing the keystone in the new archway that would frame the entrance to the oven house. It was a piece of the original field stone from the old cabin foundation, gray and speckled, with the same river gravel that had been under her husband's feet when he first staked the claim. Carol lifted it into place with her bandaged hands. The burns from the firebox crack now faded to pink scars, and the mortar squeezed around its edges like a promise sealing shut. Ida Harper stepped forward and pressed something into Carol's palm, a small tin box, rusted and dented, that Gertie's son had found while digging the new foundation trench. The box had been buried deep, wrapped in oilcloth and placed beneath the original cabin's hearthstone. Carol opened it slowly. Inside lay a folded paper, brittle and yellow, covered in a small, precise hand. It was a letter from her husband's father, the Welsh stonemason who had built the communal oven 40 years earlier. The letter was addressed to her husband, but he had died before ever finding it. The letter explained that the firebox arch had always been designed to need an iron tension brace. The original stonemason had known the arch would crack under heavy cycling, but he had run out of money for the iron and had written the specifications so that his son could finish the job when the time came. The hidden secondary draft, the ring near the chimney base, the exact measurements for the clamp that Ida Harper's husband had built in the dark during the coldest night of the Big Freeze, all of it was in the letter, laid out 40 years ahead of its purpose. The oven had never been flawed. It had been waiting. Carol stood in the doorway of her new home, the letter shaking in her hand, and looked out at the faces of the 12 families who had rebuilt her life from its foundations. Jacob Creed sat on a sawhorse nearby, his crutch propped beside him, watching the scene with an expression that contained no pride, no resentment, only a tired and grateful quiet. His wife had already brought their daughters to play with the other children in the breezeway. The mill owner who had tried to destroy Carol's oven now lived in a house framed with his own donated lumber, his own broken body a permanent reminder of the winter he had been wrong. The oven itself continued to breathe. Its fire had never completely gone out since November, and now it burned with a gentle, steady heat that filled both the oven house and the new cabin through the clay-lined breezeway. The stones that had been cold for 40 years before Carol's widowhood were now warm every single day, holding the memory of every flame that had ever been fed into them, every loaf of bread pulled from the baking chamber, every shivering body that had pressed against the warming bench and lived to see the spring. On the first truly warm evening in late April, the families gathered around the oven for a meal they had all brought piece by piece. Emma Thorne came with her infant daughter, a healthy and restless baby whose birth had been the oven's final test. Hester carried a pot of stew. Ida Harper brought a loaf of bread baked that morning in the same stones that had nearly killed them all. The meal was not a celebration. It was quieter than that. It was an acknowledgement that survival on the frontier was never a solo act, that a widow with nothing but a stone oven had taught a valley the most dangerous and beautiful truth the prairie had ever known. The storm that buries one person alone can be survived by 12 people together. And as the firelight flickered against the iron clamp that still held the arch together, Carol Hart finally understood that she had never built a business. She had built a community. The oven had been the seed. The winter had been the hammer, and what had emerged on the other side was not simply a rebuilt cabin or a repaired arch, but a permanent covenant among people who had faced death together and chosen to rebuild each other instead. The question that would echo through Miller's Fork for generations was now inescapable. What if the greatest inheritance a person can leave is not wealth or land, but a fire that continues to warm others long after the original flame is gone? Carol Hart never called herself a businesswoman. She never drafted a plan or counted margins. She simply possessed an oven and she had neighbors who were freezing. And in that endless winter, she uncovered something the frontier economy had no word for: the currency of shared heat. Generations later, the children born on that warming bench would tell their grandchildren about the widow who charged pennies to sleep on warm stones, and they would frame it not as a tale of hardship, but as a parable of improbable wealth. Because the truth carved into that prairie is that survival is rarely about what you own. It is about what you are willing to offer. Sometimes the most valuable resource on the frontier is not timber or gold or good land. It is a fire that anyone can gather around, and someone brave enough to keep it burning. Stand at the site today, and the oven still rises from the earth, a small monument of fieldstone and clay with an iron clamp still visible in the arch. If you stand quietly on a cold evening, you can almost hear the echo of 31 people breathing together, the cry of a newborn, and the creak of a door opening to rescue an enemy. Those stones hold the memory of a community that discovered its own strength only after nearly losing everything. So the question lingers: was Carol Hart a shrewd survivor who turned ruin into a livelihood, or was she simply one of the few people in that valley who understood that when the world freezes, the only way to stay warm is to pull each other close? Her oven never became a business empire. It became something far more durable. It became a testament that the best inheritance is not a fortune, but a fire that continues to warm others long after the original flame has gone. Subscribe and join us next time as we uncover more forgotten stories of ordinary people who faced impossible winters and built something that outlasted the storm.